There's been a lot of talk lately about fake news and false information. Well, one place you can go to make sure you get real information and learn real history and economics is Liberty Classroom. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Per Bylund about government regulations. Per is Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship and Records, Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He is the author of The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives, as well as The Problem of Production, a New Theory of the Firm. He is an Associate Fellow of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and an Associated Scholar with the Mises Institute. You can follow his work at perbylund.com. That's PERBYLUND.com. You can find him on Twitter at Per Bylund. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/regulations. Per, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I want to start out with some definitions, but before we even get to that, since we'll be talking about how government regulations distort the market and alter the market, let's talk about the market itself. So what is the market and what isn't the market, and how does the market work in the absence of government regulations?
Well, that's a huge question. The market, its very smallest component is really the exchange of values between two individuals or two organizations. And from that, we can understand everything that is the market, to production, entrepreneurship, to banking and money, interest rates, and so forth. But I think when people hear about the market, they think about the financial markets. They think about the Wall Street, perhaps. Some may think about the economy. But I think it's actually bigger than that. And I follow Ludwig von Mises there in thinking that the market is really any voluntary interaction, simply because everything we do is in an exchange of some sort of value for other value. And what is so amazing about the market is its division of labor and the specialization that it entails, which makes productivity, makes us really productive, and also makes us interact. So in a sense, it is what makes society, if you think about it like that.
Sure. So then how does the market work in the absence of government regulations? Can you get into that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, it depends really on what you mean by the market, but it's just voluntary exchanges. So how does it work? Well, I produce something because I think that other people would want it, or I know that other people want something like that. And I produce that, and I focus my energies to producing that and selling it in the market, because that way I gain access to what other people produce. And that's basically it. That is the market.
Sure. All right. So let's get into some definitions. And of course, in the title of your book on the subject of government regulations, you use the terms right at the beginning, the seen and the unseen. Now, I guess this comes from Frederick Bastiat, but what do you mean by the seen and the unseen?
Well, I mean exactly what Bastiat means. So I basically stole that from him. I hope he doesn't mind. The seen is the effect that is there in plain sight. So if I do something, you can see the direct effects of it. What you don't see is what I would have done otherwise. So that's the opportunity cost of my action. In this particular context and the way that Bastiat used it, the unseen is what would have taken place had the actors not been forced to do otherwise. So if there is a regulation saying that I can't do something, I will find something else to do, of course. I will do the second best, probably. And then we can talk about the value of that second best and how that leads to other values. But what is lost is what I would have chosen. So Bastiat talks about a boy breaking the window and how people gather around, and at first they think that this boy has been very naughty, but then someone realizes that, wait a minute, This means that the owner of the window needs to buy a new window from the glazier, and that means the glazier gets more business, so the glazier can buy something else that he wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So it starts this whole chain of events that are all positives. Isn't that a good thing then? Well, that is the scene. That's what we see when he breaks the window and the owner of the window buys the new window frame. What is not seen is what this guy would have done with the money otherwise. So if he would have bought a pair of shoes, for instance. So if we break that window, the shoemaker will not sell that pair of shoes, which means that whole chain of events that will happen from selling the shoes and what the shoemaker then buys and whatnot, that will not happen. That's the unseen. So you have always the contrast between these two. I mean, Bastiat uses it in this sense of destruction of value, where you break the window, but this is exactly what happens with regulations as well. And I mean, in general, this is what always happens when we make a choice. So we choose something over something else. So that something else, it doesn't happen. That's the unseen. That's the cost of our action.
So can you give an example of how this concept would apply in the area of regulations?
Sure, there are plenty. I mean, if you have regulations, any regulation is a restriction of your actions. So a minimum wage simply says that you cannot hire someone unless you pay them over a certain level. So if you have hired someone for, say, $10 and the minimum wage is $15, then you cannot hire that person anymore. So the seen effect of raising the minimum wage to $15 would be that whoever has a job and keeps his job and gets a new job after that law has been enacted will get higher wages, it seems, right? The average wage will be higher simply because the lower wages are not there anymore. The unseen effect is that all those jobs that would have been there and paid less that no longer exist simply for the reason that you can't pay them that little. And if they're not productive enough to warrant the expense of $15 an hour, you won't hire them.
Sure. All right. And we keep using the term regulations, and of course, that's the main focus of our conversation today, but we haven't defined that term yet. So just to make sure that we're precise and clear and that the audience is following us, can you give a quick definition of what a regulation is?
Well, there are really two. I mean, the market itself, without a government, for instance, is not unregulated. It regulates itself in many ways. But the way I use it in the book and the way I think our discussion will use it is a government-imposed restriction on actions. So either a prohibition saying that you cannot act in a certain way, like you cannot hire someone for under $15 an hour, or it's a limitation that is also imposed by government saying that, well, if you do this, then it will cost you extra because you have to pay us fees and whatnot. But it can also be the opposite, which is when government says, well, if you do this, we will give you extra money to cover your costs. So a subsidy is also a type of regulation because it's a hindrance of what you would have chosen had there been no regulation. But it is an action by the public sphere, in a sense, that restricts actions or affects actions.
Sure. All right. So then what is the unrealized?
The Unrealized is sort of my addition with this book, and it really looks at what are the options that you would have had there been no regulation. So what that really means is that in any situation we of course have several options, and we can choose different actions, different ways of handling the situation. We can choose different things, and those options that are available to us are made available in one way or the other. They're not created by us ourselves, but usually by everybody around us. And if there are regulations, those affect how people act, whether me directly or other people, which eventually, through ripple effects in the market, will affect what choices I actually have, what options are presented to me in this choice situation. So the Unrealized targets those options that never come to be simply because there are regulations.
All right, so can you give some examples of this? I know one example that you talk about sometimes is sweatshops. So how do we see the unrealized in the context of the sweatshop?
Right. So sweatshop is the sort of the big example that I use in the book at the very end, showing how the unrealized concept applies to the real market. So sweatshops, I mean, they usually have two arguments about sweatshops, and one is that it's horrible working conditions, so they should be prohibited. That's sort of looking only at the scene. The other is that they really don't have any better options. So usually these people working in sweatshops, they have a choice between starvation or prostitution or something horrible like that, and working in the sweatshop, which of course is a much better alternative. That's why they're lining up for those jobs in the sweatshops, which might be hard to understand for us in the West. The unrealized is simply saying that, well, wait a minute, if there had been no regulations, if there were no barriers to entry in this market, if the government basically wasn't there in whatever ways it is there, would it be conceivable that there would be only one sweatshop offering these jobs and all the other alternatives would be terrible? My argument is that no, that's not the case, because in the market there would be other actors who would benefit from having similar sweatshops and maybe offering a little higher pay or a little different job and so forth to get those workers, simply because the sweatshops make a lot of money. The technology is obviously there, so because there are sweatshops. So why aren't there any competitors to the sweatshops that are already there? Why are the options valued so differently? So it's either the sweatshop, which is fantastic compared to all the alternatives, whereas in a market, usually our choices are between similarly valued options, which is what happens when you have an open market where people compete to satisfy your wants. So what I talk about in the book and what I argue in the book is that were it not for government regulations, there would be plenty of sweatshops, and they would compete for the labor force, which means the jobs would probably be better. The jobs would be more highly paid, and the working conditions would be better. But there's something making sure that the sweatshop is usually a monopolist employer, and that working conditions they're still better than the options, but that the working conditions do not improve more. What is that? And my answer to that is regulation.
All right, so that's obviously one way in which regulations would affect individuals and affect everyday lives. And of course, the subtitle of your book is How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives. So obviously a big part of your book then is arguing this thesis, arguing this idea. But can you give an overview beyond just the sweatshop example? Can you give an overview of sort of how regulations affect our everyday lives and affect individuals?
Well, what I do in the book is go through sort of a made-up example or theoretical society consisting of only a few people. So I walk through the effects of their actions, how the economy, this little economy in the book, grows with their production and their trade and so forth. And then I introduce a guy who imposes a regulation on top of this. So it's hard to break out one example from this, because it's really a longer story for how the economy grows to begin with, and where all these options that these people benefit from, where they come from. The sweatshop is just one application of this whole logical chain of reasoning at the very end of the book.
Yeah, can you give another application? One that maybe might be a little more relatable to people who don't live in the third world?
Well, sure. I mean, any regulation would really do. So we can do the minimum wage again. So the unrealized would be, of course, be those jobs that do not exist because we have a minimum wage. And with the minimum wage, you can argue both ways. That in one sense, yeah, it means that lower paying jobs do not exist. But on the other hand, it also gives employers a reason not to pay more, because it creates unemployment and sets a standard for what you need to pay. So it keeps wages low as well. The unrealized here, of course, is all those jobs that would have existed had it not been for the minimum wage. So the scene is that people are paid $7.25 or whatever the federal minimum wage is now in all these jobs, and raising the minimum wage would probably mean that some of these jobs would get lost. But the question is, what are the options for all those people working for a minimum wage? What options would they have had there been no minimum wage? So this would mean, well, there would be probably a lot of easier, more manual labor type of jobs. There would be probably higher productivity of all workers, simply because there would be machinery and so forth. I can take one example from my own background of how a country has used this type of thing. Maybe that will clarify things. Sweden, which, I mean, is known as sort of a socialist utopia in a sense. In Sweden, there are basically no low-income jobs available at all. There's no minimum wage, but there's still regulations that are similar to the minimum wage. They keep the wages up to a certain level. And government has, over decades, invested a lot in increasing the capital stock, that is machinery and productivity enhancing capital in the economy. So every worker is basically very productive because every worker has a lot of machinery to support whatever labor is carried out. This, of course, means also that there are no entry-level jobs in the Swedish market. So now with the recent immigration crisis, with a lot of people going to Sweden, they cannot get jobs because those jobs do not exist anymore. And this is something that the government has created through outlawing basically low-paying jobs and working consciously and strategically to weed out companies that are not productive enough. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and that's a good example, a good application of it. So when you have these government regulations, who are the winners and who are the losers?
Well, if you have, it is in the book when I walk through these examples, if you just add one regulation, you will have winners on the side of the seen, of course, and losers on the side of the unseen, and you will have a long chain of events that happen because of the regulation or in response to the regulation. Those would be relative winners. And you have this whole chain of events that does not happen because of the regulation. Those would be the losers. And who is on the winning or the losing side of this? Well, it depends on each regulation and basically what point in time you look at, because regulations tend to come back and affect the options that you have in any choice situation. So even if you are on the winning side in the beginning of the chain, you might end up on the losing side at the very end. There's really just one group that wins every time, and that is those who have political power, those who impose the regulations, because they can get reelected. They can probably hire more of their kind to run the bureaucratic machine to make sure that the regulations are enforced. So there are plenty of winners and losers, but the group that is always on the winning side would be politicians and bureaucrats.
Sure. All right. Now, before we get on to some more examples of regulations and the economic effects of them, I want to return to the whole notion of destruction and how the market deals with that, and the seen and the unseen coming off from that, and the consequences of that. And earlier, of course, you were citing Bastiat's example of someone breaking a window, the broken window fallacy, and explaining this from there. But on a much larger scale, a form of destruction that we might see that human beings have basically no control over is a natural disaster. And in your book, you talk about how the market handles natural disasters. But can you give sort of an overview of that process so that we can better see some of these concepts that we were discussing a little bit earlier?
Right. So disasters and really destruction in general is an interesting sort of counterpoint, or at least I imagine that it would be to my argument about regulations. Simply because it is destructive, it removes options from people in any choice situation. Of course, if you think of war, for instance, people have their homes bombed to pieces. They lose family members. They lose basically everything. And this, of course, is a problem for the choice situation, because they're stripped of a number of choices. So isn't this really the same effect as regulation, would be the question. And my argument would be no, and I go through this in the book as well, simply because when you have value destroyed that you had before, you update your preferences. So this guy with the broken window, he was not interested in getting another window before it was broken. But because it was broken, he re-ranked his preferences. So suddenly a new window was what he valued most for whatever money he had left. So he would buy a new window rather than the shoes, not because he objectively values windows more than shoes, because when he had a window, he would rather buy the shoes. But since he lost the window became more important to him. So when we update all our preferences like that, this is very different from regulation. Simply because regulation does not really, it does not effectuate a change in how we rank things. It just says that you cannot go there, you cannot do a certain thing, but it doesn't change our preferences. So when you have a large-scale disaster, it could be an illness or a war or anything major like that. What happens if we see all this new economic activity, as people like Paul Krugman would talk about, and how that's a good thing in his world. But what really happens is that in the face of this disaster, people update their preferences and suddenly they say, well, leisure is not as important to me anymore because I don't have a home. So I will invest my time and effort into building a new home, or I will work for free in the new hospital in a tent nearby to take care of anyone who is injured or whatever it is. So we update all our preferences in this sense when we're affected by disaster. Had there been a regulation instead that said, no, you're no longer allowed to have leisure time or whatever, then it's very different, because we still value that leisure time, and we would have chosen that leisure time had we been allowed to. So we are stripped of this value, and we still want to choose it. Whereas in the face of disaster, yeah, we're stripped of this option, but we do not want to choose it anymore because we now have other options and other courses of action that are valued much more highly.
Friends, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of history, economics, political theory, the sorts of topics we cover on this show, then check out Liberty Classroom, featuring a wide variety of courses, including some that are taught by professors who have been guests on this show, such as Kevin Gutzman, Jason Jewell, and G.P. Manish. Liberty Classroom will provide you with videos, audio files, question and answer sessions, discussion forums, and all of the resources you need to become a better debater and have a deeper knowledge of American history, world history, economics, political theory, and more. Learn real history and economics right at your computer or on the go, and be able to more confidently and clearly articulate your views. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn the information necessary to become a master debater for a mere 24 cents a day. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to find out more about Liberty Classroom and to help support the Wake Up Call podcast. Sure, and yet every time one of these natural disasters hits, an earthquake or a hurricane or a tsunami or whatever, we still hear politicians and pundits and even economists saying that this is actually good for the economy because it's going to create jobs. So these fallacies are still very much around.
Yeah, but that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you would remove the minimum wage, that would have the same effect on jobs, but they're not willing to do that. And they're also not willing to outlaw anything. I mean, with this type of reasoning, shouldn't you bomb a few cities in the U.S. and just to make sure that people get off their fat asses and start working? Because they would, I'm sure, if you bomb their houses. But that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that, well, it's good to have economic activity, and this is going to create a lot more now that we have destruction. But what they're really saying is that, yeah, we have a lot of suffering. People have lost a lot of value in lives and so forth. And because they change their preferences, and then they start working, and that's a good thing. But what they're really talking about is the loss. That's why you have this increased economic activity and those extra jobs and so forth. That's because we have lost value and updated our preferences. That's not anything to say is good or beneficial in any sense, because it's a loss. That's what it is.
Right, yeah, definitely. So let's turn our attention, before we wrap up, back to regulations and look at some policies that are implemented by governments to try to steer the economy or to steer personal behavior. And one regulation, one policy that you mentioned a little bit earlier, very briefly, is prohibition. Can you get into the economic effects of prohibition and the fallout from such regulations?
Well, sure. I mean, this is fairly well known. I mean, even among mainstream economists, what happened during Prohibition. Because simply the government saying that, no, you may not drink alcohol doesn't mean that people stop valuing drinking alcohol. Had there been, say, a natural disaster that completely, destroyed all alcoholic beverages or whatnot, people would choose different things. But now they had the choice of, okay, I'll break the law and risk fines or jail or whatnot and get the alcohol that I really want, or I'll do something different. Well, depending on how risk averse you are, you will choose to break the law. And that happens really with anything that the government says you cannot do. It's not the case with alcohol today unless you're underage, but with recreational drugs, for instance, where the government says you cannot. But that doesn't mean that people do not want to anymore. It just means that they will have to take on a much larger risk to do whatever it is they want. This, of course, increases problems with real crimes, and we saw that during the Prohibition with the mafia taking over supply chains simply because you have to be in the black market to sell alcohol, which means the mafia is very well positioned to run these really market functions. So you give them a chance for extra power and extra influence, and of course they don't mind using methods that a regular entrepreneur would not use. So machine guns would not be strange at all for them to use to protect their supply chains, and they wouldn't or compete in a sense with other suppliers of alcohol. It would also mean that, well, without any real competition, and since everybody's hiding from the law, you would have problems with the quality of what is sold, because that's one way you compete in an open market, and you can let everybody know that what I'm selling is a superior product. That's what happens in any open and legal market. When you prohibit a certain good like alcohol or recreational drugs, you cannot advertise this anymore, which means you don't have a way of communicating with your customers, which also means that, well, in order to get as much as possible out of this that is really costly to provide to consumers nowadays because of the government, you might think of diluting it with something that is cheaper. And we see that today with recreational drugs, how you first of all try to make it much more concentrated than it was before, simply because it's easier to smuggle more concentrated products because it's smaller, it's harder to find. And then you dilute it with something else that is a lot cheaper and that is legal, which means the drugs are more potent and you get other stuff in there, so they're not pure either. And this is also something that happened during Prohibition with alcohol, where you couldn't really trust the quality of the product, while you had mafiosos running the supply chains.
Sure, and we've had Mark Thornton on the show to talk about how we see these concepts apply to heroin and apply in the context of the drug war. So linked from the show notes page for this episode, which is wakeupcallpodcast.com/regulations, you can find those episodes. But I want to look at another policy that is supposed to perfect the market, quote unquote, and that's the whole idea of subsidies. So what are the effects of subsidies, and why do they fail to fix the market even though that's their attempt?
Well, the thing is, it sort of depends on what you want to accomplish, because when you subsidize something, you get more of it. And that is the intent. So when you subsidize corn and you pay a lot extra for corn, which is really what it means, you get more people producing corn. Of course, the economy is a closed system, and it is endogenous, as we would say, we economists, which means that you can't really just add stuff to the economy without the economy producing it itself. So if you from the outside, which we could consider government, then try to stimulate the production of a certain good like corn through subsidies, you're really just redirecting resources from other places. So in order to get more corn, you probably get less farmland used for something else. And it probably turns out that it's not exactly that else that you hoped for that farmers abandon. And you might even get a lot more more corn after the subsidy than you hoped for. You can't really tweak the market as a machine because people respond in certain ways depending on the situation and their expectations and so forth. So you can't really know exactly how much more corn there will be, even though some economists like to pretend that is the case.
All right, and then an argument that you'll hear sometimes in favor of regulations is that they're necessary because otherwise you would see the exploitation of workers. Now, we looked at the sweatshop context earlier and discussed how maybe that's not the case there because these workers in large part choose to work in sweatshops because that's the best option they have. The regulations are hampering the opportunity for competitors to jump into that area, and the alternatives that do exist are inferior options to working in the sweatshop. But in general, why is it not the case that government regulations can prevent the exploitation of workers, and why does the free market handle that situation better?
Well, simply because the government doesn't create anything. So, I mean, that's what we talked about all along, and that I mentioned just a minute ago as well, that when the government comes in and says, you cannot do this is not adding value to the market. This is not saying that, suddenly all the workers are more productive, so of course they should get paid more. It is saying that you cannot do this, which means that is restricted from your set of options. That is not any way of making anybody richer. The economy doesn't work better because it has fewer options. You might be able to steer actions into a certain area doing this, but that would still be of less value than actors would have chosen otherwise. And that's the whole thing with the Unrealized, that you get rid of or you outlaw all these options by restricting actions. So Could you remind me of the question again?
Yes. Yeah, why are government regulations unsuccessful in preventing the quote-unquote exploitation of workers? And why is the exploitation of workers not the problem in the free market that some might claim it is?
Right. So the market handles this better. And I argue in the book that the market is not perfect in any sense. So there is no general equilibrium or a utopia where the market fixes everything. But the issue is really whether this imperfect market is let be and let work the way it works, or if we add restrictions to it. And of course, it's a logical fallacy to say that a restriction means you get more options. That is simply not the case. And what I argue in the book is that the number of options is what makes us rich, simply because of opportunity cost. And the sweatshop example is an attempt to illustrate this, saying that, well, if you don't get options, if your options are restricted, if you have plenty of unrealized possibilities, that means that the value of your options are not even close to the same, just like in the sweatshop example. So one of the options would appear to be a lot more valuable simply because the other ones of similar value are unrealized. So one example of thinking about this is that usually in the market, when we make choices, we make choices as we do when we buy apples, where you have plenty of apples and they're basically the same, and you value them sort of the same, but you pick one or you pick two or you pick a dozen or whatever it is you want, and you pick those that are best for you or that suit your needs. The opportunity cost would be the other apples that you didn't pick, which are of similar value but not as valuable since you didn't choose them. The sweatshop example shows simply that, well, the government has says that if you want to, in this case, perhaps a dozen apples, the store only has a dozen apples. Either you pick those or you pick pears or oranges or whatever else. But if you want apples, those are the only ones, which of course doesn't make you richer in any sense. And the same thing really applies to the labor market, which is where the exploitation happens. That if a worker has only a couple of options, then he will necessarily, of course, choose the better option for him. But that also means that you have less value in all of your options. In an open market, you would have plenty of options. You wouldn't have unlimited set of options, of course, but you would have several options. And when you regulate, that simply means that some of these options are taken away from you. It doesn't mean that you get a higher wage. It doesn't mean that you get a better job. It just means that some of the options that you would have had are not there anymore. And that's the point of the unrealized. So it's whether we're exploited or not, and I would argue that we're not automatically exploited just because we have a job. But the point is not that the market as it is should be compared to a utopia, because there is none. Maybe we're heading that way, especially if we deregulate, but we're not there in any sense. The options we have is what is created in the market and any situation where some of those options are not there anymore. And those are the options we have. So even if it doesn't matter how imperfect the market is, a regulated market necessarily is less perfect.
All right, so one final question for you before we wrap up, and that is, given the current setup and given all of the government regulations that are in place, what do you view as the best solution, and what would the implications of your solution be?
Well, that's a question that I've debated quite a bit over the years. And the thing is, with an overly regulated society as the one we have, we can pick a favorite regulation that we want to roll back or get rid of or whatnot. Well, that will only roll back part of it. So whatever problems are caused by this regulation, it might also solve problems caused by other regulations. So if you roll this one back, say Obamacare, for instance, it doesn't mean that you get perfect healthcare suddenly. It just means that we get rid of the problems caused by Obamacare, and we also get rid of whatever is solved due to Obamacare, probably unintentionally, but still. So we get back to a situation that is also imperfect. And I don't see a solution where you can solve problems without harming anyone, which would be, in my view at least, ideal. I don't see how you can do that by rolling back anything step by step, or removing a single regulation, or two of them, or a dozen, or something. The only solution that I can think of that would work would be to get rid of all of it at once. That would probably cause a little problems temporarily before everything settles down again. But that's the only way of getting rid of all these problems and misallocations, really, of resources that are caused by regulations in one form or the other. And those are always, at least in my experience, blamed on the market, quote unquote, whereas it is not. And that's sort of the point of discussing the unrealized, to show that, well, the reason you don't have better choices is because of the regulations. It's not the market's fault. The market would have supplied you with other options. So I don't think there is a utopia possible, but I do think that the best way forward would be to simply get rid of all of those things that cause these problems, and that would be get rid of all the regulations at once, preferably, because that wouldn't cause any problems during this while we deregulate, so to speak.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. If someone wants to learn more about the topics we've been discussing in this interview, and if someone wants to follow your work in particular, what resources or readings or websites would you direct them to?
Well, there are plenty online. I would actually recommend going to the classics. Read Bastiat's essay on the seen and the unseen. That's a good start. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is also a good start. The Mises Institute's website is full of free books and articles, of course, so that would be a good start. And well, if you're actually interested in these issues and want to read about it, I don't think I need to provide any more links than to the Mises Institute, because there is enough there to. Well, you can probably read for a couple of lifetimes at least if you want to go through all that material.
Sure. And how about following your work in particular?
Well, absolutely. I write a little here and there. I write at the Mises Institute, of course. I write at the Libertarian Institute. I write at the Swedish Mises Institute as well. Following me on Twitter would probably be a good way as well. I try to post there every day, and I link to a lot of articles that I read and that I write and comment on as well.
Okay, great. Well, I want to remind everybody to go take a look at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/regulations, and there will be links to related episodes on drug prohibition and the minimum wage and sweatshops, as well as to perbylund.com and the Twitter handle at perbylund, and all of the readings and resources that were just mentioned. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/regulations is the show notes page for this episode. And again, Per's book on this subject is titled The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives. And of course, that will also be linked at wakeupcallpodcast.com/regulations. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher, so that you can get all the episodes of the Wake Up Call podcast and not miss any. And Per, thank you so much for your time today, for joining me to discuss government regulations and discuss your book on the subject. And I look forward to having you back on the show sometime in the near future so that we can discuss another topic.
Thank you. It was great to be on.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.